Good evening all. My name is Fabrizio and I'm a yeoman of the company since 2014. So I know I need to become a freeman. I know. It's on my list to-do list for 2021. So, okay, I felt my ear being pulled by, Anthony and Andrew and everyone who was kind enough to be there when I was inaugurated as a yeoman a long time ago now. I am principal urban designer at Enfield Council. In my role, I essentially advise or give the urban design advice for the local authority for large strategic schemes, which are Meridian Water and Edmonton, which are the schemes that at the moment the local authority is having a lot of pressure to deliver homes, deliver a mixed density schemes, and it has substantial levels of investment. So it's no mean feat, and it takes a lot of people to deliver. So that will keep me busy for some time. But what I'll be presenting to you today is not Enfield work, but more my own research that I did as part of my studies at the Bartlett School of Planning, which is on density, which is a subject which I know everyone will have an opinion on. It is very topical, more so now when we live in times of lockdown. You may feel more attuned now to the comfort of your house, and also more aware of the discomfort of other people's state of accommodation as we are now in lockdown. It is a complex subject, and I will do my best to make an introduction on the subject and discuss its implications in planning. It is definitely not academic, and it affects our daily lives. Housing and city are intrinsic, and we recognize this as part of how we live, culture, economy, and well-being. Low-density housing, like terrace housing, is a key part of UK urbanism. However, increase of demand and need to deliver housing to a rising population has required forms of higher density to be developed chip by jowl. As you can see, this is one picture I took when I was doing my walk in Vauxhall in 9 Elms. Their planning and the suitability are the subject of great contention in planning. So no surprises that this scheme obviously had lots of opposition from residents and from many organizations. And yet, despite of all that, it came through in the shape that it did. But besides suitability, density is also associated with other issues. It is present in low quality homes. Microflats or their unscrupulous counterparts, as shown in this picture, where you can see someone expected to live next to their shower, are a byproduct of the desire to live in areas with high demand and high cost. So this leads to a compact living, which is high density of people. As development is proposed in areas of high demand or earmarked for regeneration, the need to densify becomes a contentious matter. Loss of open space is high density of built space. Even in low density areas, the need for homes becomes a tool for oppression and lead to unsanitary conditions caused by substandard accommodation and crowding. This is an example of covert high density housing, where it is seen from street view that is perfectly acceptable ways of accommodation by terrace house setting, but actually has a higher population count, living in unequal living conditions. Which in today's public health crisis is no surprise that crowding and housing deficiencies has eased transmission of the virus and made self-isolation more difficult. So here, density is linked to issues with public health and quality of life in times of lockdown. So that is just basically a quick overview of what people may have, their own personal experience with density, or how they just approach it just from the media or from just your professional experience or daily lives. But I'm just going to drill a little bit deeper on the definition itself, because I think it's important for us to understand what the word means, and because that is basically the basis in which planning uses it as a tool for essentially planning cities. It is a transversal subject, as you can see. It cuts through basically all forms of subjects in health, place, living, quality, and so forth. So I will give an overview of the concept. Density can be defined as physical density. So this is something that is measured and is based on physical factors. How tall buildings are, how many there are, the amount of open space, number of people living, etc. So a very crude way of measuring density is, for example, dwellings per hectare. And I'm sure that all of you have sort of counted this metric in your professional lives. It is an index that represents, the number of dwellings per hectare. But this can also be shown at buildings and take many shapes. So the same metric can be seen as a tall building, as a low-rise terrace scheme, or medium-rise courtyard scheme. And this just shows that density is actually relative. It's relative to build form, relative to build space. Height is associated to buildings and in turn to a measured index of density. So in this case, floor area ratio. This is a map of London where the tallest buildings are shown in red. So you can definitely pick up there the square mile on the left, but also Canary Wharf to the right. In here, higher densities can be linked to taller buildings due to increase in floor area. But it is also true that not all buildings have people living in. So this index needs to be used with care. And well, another one is, for example, daylight and sunlight, where, I mean, this is again a view from the square mile, where you can just appreciate that the higher you are, the more exposure to daylight and sunlight you have. So the areas in orange, and the more in shadow are areas that are like on ground floor. So this also sets another constraint, which is a minimum amount of daylight secured for amenity and for health reasons, which is also governed by rights of light jurisdictions in terms of taking into account by newer developments, restricting height and by virtue also restricting density. And finally, built and unbuilt, which in this case is a map of London showing the green areas. But rather than just making focus on the green areas, one can also appreciate that the white areas will be where there is obviously built form. So you can appreciate that built and unbuilt is also a part where you can identify higher density by where there is no development. But what I just want to highlight here, and this is basically the thesis that I just like to present to you. By all means, I don't want to ramble on for too long. So if you do have a question, just ask me. That's fine. But what I do want to highlight is, how we perceive density is I personally believe is far more important than the physical, because this is a personal side, which is where much of the contentiousness of density comes from. There are individual cognitive factors and sociocultural factors, a personal level of tolerance to density, a sense of crowding, and one's own response to external cues by your setting. So in my opinion, this side of density is the most difficult to address in policy, as it is an unmeasurable and it's highly subjective. And this is also the source of much of the issues in planning for high density, as I experienced in my daily job. I'm actually quite happy to see Vivian here, because he will probably recognize much of these pictures are from Singapore, because how we perceive certain settings, different or like our own, trigger a response to feeling of crowdedness or acceptability of such a space. This is a personal view, a personal level of tolerance. For someone born in Singapore, this picture shows daily life. But for someone from Buckinghamshire, it might have instantly evoke a sense of oppression, as it is a different urban reality. There are moments of high density at times, like in an elevator, where crowdedness is heightened, but we know it is just for a moment. So high density can be perceived voluntarily or involuntarily by how the built environment is designed. But while the latter are personal responses to density, it can also be collective. So this image of Grand Central immediately evokes a sense of busyness, rush hour, crowdedness, high density, to the point that actually it becomes a cultural element, an idea, where actually language starts to borrow that, and you have phrases like, for example, busy as Grand Central, which we now know is not the case. So this shows that our perception of density is both a personal response and a sociocultural collective response. Compounding this with physical density, we get perceived density. And this is what many of the scholars on the subject have essentially coined. But planning for density involves planning both realms, the physical and the perceived. So this conflict is what my high density buildings in planning result in much opposition, because how you contend with both. I'll now sort of talk about the London setting, just to give an example of how London manages density. So you get an idea of how it's planned for and the limitations of planning density. You may remember this document and also the density matrix, which is from the old London plan. This study at the time of the Sustainable Residential Quality report essentially picked up define capacity by picking test sites across London, test its capacity depending on the location, and identify them as either suburban, urban, or central character, and also laid out according to public transport accessibility level, PTAL, and that sets a range that became the basis of negotiations with local authorities. And this was a tool used up until the new London plan, which essentially discards it. Which, from, as you probably know, from around Christmas, there has been a recent update on the London plan, which will imminently be published. But this plan has a density reform, which is one that no longer uses a matrix, which was a good starting point to have conversation, but just essentially discards it, recognizing that London grows far more polycentrically than any density matrix could possibly pretend to represent. And actually, it's more important to look at the specifics or the context to inform density rather than having another arbitrary metric. So what the approach is now is one that is based on context, the amount of open space, social infrastructure, connectivity, and these points very much go back to what I was explaining earlier, how density physically and is measured and perceived. So it borrows very much on these same points, but it also includes typology, so like types of buildings, whether they are line blocks, towers, courtyard blocks, etc., to determine the density and the capacity of a scheme and how a context can absorb based on development need. So you can expect that this opens up a messy process of conflicted views, personal views, and a battle of consultant and planners, because there's no longer a starting point with a matrix, but it's basically how good is one side to argue for one density as opposed to another. So my research was done to look at very large density schemes in London. And what I did was basically looked at called-in applications. If you're not familiar with the process, the mayor has the capacity to call in a scheme that must be of a strategic scale, so of a certain height, of a certain numbers, after a local authority determines it, so that he overrides the local authority by obviously having this strategic side that the London mayor has. So by looking at these applications, it was possible to see how density was managed in policy and the response of community and developers, because these are, so to speak, the most contentious applications that London has handled in at least the last two mayor administrations. So I essentially pick up 19, and there you can possibly see West Ferry Printworks, which is the highly contentious one that recently has been in the press because of Housing Secretary being involved in it in an unduly fashion. Now, looking at these applications also was beneficial because it was from across London. So I wasn't just focusing on one, it was a transversal approach to seeing schemes in London as a pool of applications. Now, don't be scared, this table is scary, but I will definitely stop now a little bit and go slower just to sort of share with you the findings, because some of them are actually quite salient of a process that probably needs improvement. Basically, this table lists on the left-hand side these 19 applications, but it also highlights that these applications were decided with the matrix in mind, or a range that the local authority sets, which is this column linked to a character. But what is important to note is that in most instances, the density was over the range that was set for policy and by the local authority. So essentially is they all had to justify why they were exceeding it. Another point to raise is that as part of the calling process, the applications can be developed. So while the reasons for refusal for most of these schemes were, too tall, too overdeveloped, the massing is incongruous with the setting, the GLA thought otherwise. They suddenly, on approval, they actually accepted all those considerations to be resolved, either by part of the process or by the assessment of their own officers. So I will now go through some sort of extracts I found in reading all of these GLA reports. So, I've done the homework for all of you. I've gone through all of the reports from the GLA, from the local authority, from these applications, and I found, some gems I'd like to share with you because it explains, this conflict, or rather pool between what policy document says that should be a desired density, and what ultimately ends up being the case. So in Ancient Drive, in Convoy's Wharf in Deptford, the GLA concluded that high densities are acceptable due to the high quality design of residential units. Design compensating the impact of amenity it had and open space availability. So, could we say that that was an adequate way of resolving the scheme? Can high quality design, i.e. how it looks and and the detailing, trump the need for open space or the need for daylight, if ultimately that's how amenity is sort of gauged? In Ancient Drive in Greenwich, the refusal was from the local authority was based on overlooking. So that is when buildings were just too close to each other. Normally 18 to 20 meters distance is what is understood to be like a decent distance between blocks. Obviously, the taller the building are, the more impact they have on shadow, but also just the number of families living together, you would expect buildings to be somewhat separately apart. But the GLA thought otherwise. They actually stated that, the actually housing supplementary planning guidance document states that, if you adhere too rigidly to these measures, you can limit the variety of urban spaces and housing types in the city, and can sometimes unnecessarily restrict density. So in this case, the GLA sort of applied more of a discretionary interpretation of like, you don't adhere to those rules because otherwise, you won't allow for density to vary, and the scheme would approve. So this shows a conflict between local determination and regional determination. The GLA in its regional level assessment would consider the schemes in favor to other strategic goals, such as housing contribution. So one could argue that the GLA pushes very much on the delivery of housing and finds an argument to justify the higher densities by other means. And this is something that I also looked in detail, the actual delivery of housing units that each of these schemes sort of provided. Again, scary table, so I'll just go slowly here. Basically, the main point here is that none of the schemes, and you can see them in red, actually met the proposed tenure split that the local authority was targeting, and also the affordable housing target, again, was not met by the majority of them. So again, you kind of question, how is it that these schemes can proceed with refusal from the local authority, being deemed unacceptable in terms of height and scale, not meeting the tenure split, not meeting the affordable housing contribution? How is it that these schemes do continue? And again, I'll just read through some of these quotes taken from the reports. And in this case, in the scheme in Dagenham, the justification to not meet affordable housing targets was that the scheme provides a significant amount of new family housing and was considered acceptable. So again, discretion sort of trumps targets and trumps policy. Again, in the case of Ancient Drive, while the scheme was not in a designated area for tall buildings, the immediate context was changing to the point that one could argue that tall schemes could be included. So again, that was difficult in that you're basically planning for the future, and if there are schemes that are tall and one's been approved, then precedent is in your favor to suggest that you could then ride on that trend. In Newcomb House, the GLA stated that the proposed quantum of affordable units equal 66% of the total number of affordable units approved in the last 3 financial years. So past performance on delivery was used as a way of saying, well, this does most of the heavy lifting that you haven't done in the past, so approve it. And in Islington, the GLA negotiated below target affordable housing contributions contingent to not having a review mechanism, which is where the affordable housing contribution is calculated after the scheme reaches a certain stage. But that mechanism was essentially rescinded in favor of actually agreed a fixed contribution, which is debatable and one could argue was it really necessary. So this reveals that the reality of planning based on negotiations, securing planning gain, and delivering on targets and managing the delivery of high quality schemes is complicated. At times, one priority pulls harder than other, and in these cases, it seems obvious that housing delivery trumped most of the grounds on which schemes should be assessed. The GLA's mandate revealed how it may be argued that the need to deliver homes is what has been driving the determination of high-density schemes in London. When dealing with applications, policy targets have been shown to be negotiable. And this table basically lists how the community has consistently opposed these schemes, and the mayor has consistently reverted that and choose to accept these schemes. Which leads to my point of perception, because ultimately it is the residents that are, by being long-term residents of an area, that they have a more of a personal connection to how these schemes would change their setting, and they would have a response or a position to these schemes based on their own personal experience. So obviously this part of the research was just based on big schemes and broad assessment just based on targets, but I would just like to now talk about an example that sort of encapsulate how perceived density was sort of managed in the planning process, or rather not well managed, so that in the end I can just share with you some recommendations, and definitely would very much like to hear your views, as this is a subject that, again, I work daily basis, and it's a topic that I would just like to know your views on. This in turn, as you know, is associated with terrace houses and medium density living. Mount Pleasant was the site of a former Royal Mail depot that was sold, and is the site for a large 700 homes Central London development. Prior to the application, Camden Council and Islington Council, as the site covers two local authorities, engaged local residents in a strategic planning document consultation to inform the extent of development. So you can see that the areas in blue are where tall buildings are there at the moment. And this is what the SPD document proposed that tall buildings should be. So accepting that there would be tall buildings in this scheme just by need to provide homes, but clustering them in a way that they are with the existing one, and yet respecting the area being primarily low density, shorter buildings would be the main approach for development. As a development scheme was brought in, the Mount Pleasant Neighborhood Forum, with the support of Create Streets, developed an alternative vision that maintained the spirit of the SPD and of residents' expectations. So the scheme borrowed from traditional Islington typologies, showing a higher density vision than the one actually proposed. So again, this kind of ties back to my point I made earlier on, you can have the same density in many ways. And the neighbors were more in support of this approach, which was, the mansion block typology, as opposed to tall buildings with medium buildings as the developer proposed. So when you compare, on the left, what the developer proposed in terms of location of tall buildings and what the alternative scheme proposed, you can definitely see that the alternative scheme was more following the spirit of the SPD as opposed to the developer, which was the source of opposition from the residents. The proposed higher density scheme with taller buildings in areas not considered suitable would impact their amenity, the daylight, support the character, and ultimately impact the life of quality of life of the residents. And I just want to go back to the point of perception, because these are matters that are measurable, but they're also perceived, such as character and quality of life. These are personal matters. So the SPD was a document that was intended to manage the expectation of development. However, the residents took it upon themselves to present an alternative vision that did. So the important point to raise here is that the shadow scheme, on the one on the right, was not less dense, but just in line with resident expectations. The image on the left is the developer scheme. In the previous slides, it was shown how the same density can be delivered by different buildings, heights, and typologies. In this setting, the contention was whether the proposed taller buildings by the developer would be contextual and deliver high-quality homes. The residents' view was that it was not the case, and took it upon themselves to do an alternative one. This reflects how their perception of density based on their personal life experience and sociocultural sensibilities favor that type of development as opposed to another high-density model. Indeed, the neighborhood forum's view was that maybe the 21st century version of the mansion block can create even higher densities. So this is view that does not oppose tall buildings or high density, but the manner and opening up discussion about suitable typologies, which I think is one of the virtues of the discretionary system that we have in the UK for planning, is that it invites that contribution by residents. And I'm sure that many of your either as a professional capacity or in a personal capacity, you've been engaged in planning applications on consultation processes, and the forum is there, but one would expect that your views are heard. So while the decision was made by the mayor, the developer scheme was ultimately approved, the neighborhood forum remains to this day committed to present an organized community response to future schemes in the area. So, well, as already said, the planning process offers the forum for engagement where these conflicting views can be discussed. However, in this instance, as shown by the survey of coding applications, the strategic dominance to deliver homes trumped the residents' views, as this was also the case in this scheme. I will now just sort of go into presenting some recommendations, because I've essentially described how strategic applications are determined in favor of housing delivery, and how an example of a large scheme was resolved despite residents' input with alternative schemes. I would like to share these and hopefully get your views on their merit and other thoughts that you may have on the subject. Because of my training, these recommendations are design-based and are at planning stage, but by all means, I definitely would like to know your views from your own professional viewpoint. Firstly, it's apparent that consultation is key. The Mount Pleasant example shows how a shadow scheme can inform community's input during the termination of applications. For large schemes, this can help in giving meaningful consultation input and lead to a scheme that addresses needs of developers, planners, and residents. I was involved in such exercise with the Community Action Group for Holloway, so that's me, which was shared with councillors in Islington and residents. The site was a scheme in the former Holloway prison, which Peabody is developing, if you're not familiar with the site. This shadow scheme reconciled with the development capacity requirements of 800 units, so it wasn't shying away from what was set as a strategic goal. However, it put at the heart the need for open space. As you may know, Islington is a very dense borough, and actually there's quite a lack of open spaces, so this site was particularly earmarked for hopefully providing that, and especially requested by the residents. And offered a variety of densities, taller buildings facing the courtyards, as you can see here, but also terraces facing adjacent existing houses, in order to sort of stitch the built fabric. Seeing the current scheme in consultation as of October of 2020, this is the actual proposal by Peabody with architects AHMM. The density is higher than what was originally envisioned, but you can see that the tall buildings are actually located within the courtyard. So, you know, one could definitely see that the shadow scheme process with the residents actually, hopefully, inform their own input when it comes to consultation to actually request things that hopefully the architects took on board, because you can see also, for example, the terrace housing on the side and indeed a provision of open space, not as much as one would expect, but you know, again, this comes from the nature of planning requiring, you know, balance and compromise and engagement with all stakeholders. So this is planning for density, which is my recommendation, with community engagement with design of using shadow schemes to essentially communicate the various requirements of stakeholders along the planning process. Another thing, which is kind of what I stressed earlier, was that we should not forget perception in shaping our views of density, whether we find them acceptable or not, whether we oppose or support a scheme. This image, taken from a document from Graham Ingham Surveyors, shows how if one assesses the mansion houses, the mansion blocks of Victoria, they would be too tall if one assesses it with current daylight requirements that new buildings have to manage. So this is an example of how design-led approach for new schemes wants to reconcile with strictness of policy based on numbers. It does open the capacity of design process, but also invites contention and requires added input from all stakeholders. If there's a disposition for higher intensity typologies like mansion blocks, but not for higher density contemporary development, that results in the same quality of environment, then I feel that the objection for high density is based on a much more personal level. And here, unfortunately, I'm going to say the word style. This leads to a problematic planning process where style is used to encapsulate one's personal taste, drawn from sociocultural background. As mentioned earlier, this informs one's perception of density and remains a problematic aspect of in planning. Because again, this, as explained earlier, this is highly subjective, this is personal, and it is something that informs one's views and ultimate contribution to the planning process. So it must be something that has to be reconciled. And I feel that design has a strong agency in bridging that need to deliver homes, but also culture of tolerance to density for residents. So to do this, there are tools that can show how proposed schemes would sit in the context of the wider city. WCC, if I'm sure some of you have used it, if not, it's a fantastic resource. It's a tool that shows, essentially, it's a 3D map of London. It's a 3D model of London, rather, and it's very accurate and is used by most local authorities, and I use it daily. This image shows the Mount Pleasant scheme in blue. And I added quickly extrusions to show how buildings that were of a certain age, say 1950s blocks, would potentially be developed. But it's important to start visualizing, the city as it emerges, as new densities are proposed. And these tools allow you to assess them and to visualize them far more intuitively and more attuned to, again, physical density, your own perception. That has probably been the case. So this can potentially bridge the gap between these two definitions, because you're designing for projected densities and you're also visualizing them. Therefore, sort of making your mind or making you less sensitive to higher densities, as one is essentially training oneself to expect them. Now, this last point is important, as I presented earlier, on the symbolic and sociocultural factors of density, which the image of Grand Central, as it influences perceived density. It is one's experience and exposure to various densities that influences one's resilience to crowdedness and capacity to accept higher density. This image shows how in Singapore, despite their higher density housing, open spaces are still planned and designed to offer the choice of density experiences. This is important as it conditions an expectation of development and allows for higher density in an island city estate with limited land. High density does not mean crowdedness. I need to emphasize it a lot, as all homes are of high quality with adequate space standards. Well, obviously this is an extreme example. We are already doing that in the UK. This density variety is what is already done in highly successful schemes, for example, in the Barbican, where homes of high quality, healthy space standards, access to open spaces, social infrastructure, and of varied density, ranging from blocks and towers in the heart of the city, have been delivered. The fact that schemes like the Barbican have been delivered demonstrates that the limitation of endorsing these schemes may be one caused by perceived density, as the built environment profession has shown that schemes can be designed at a high density and be very successful. So what I propose is the research highlights that in practice, perceived density is not addressed in policy and remains an issue deeply personal to communities. I believe that including this aspect of density in the design-led approach to planning will help in managing contentions and the resulting meaningful engagement of high density schemes, which is the direction of travel of the London Plan. This diagram shows how density is managed by developers, community, and local authority, mindful of the two aspects, physical density and perceived densities, to define capacity. This will basically this is the vision. Obviously, the efficacy of either party and the literacy in terms of design terms to sort of essentially meet in the middle is crucial. So while shadow schemes are vital, they are only as good as the input provided and the support and the professional support given to communities. I would like to conclude though that to plan for density, it is required to address both physical and perceived density. Current density planning addresses these, but clearly with a favor to strategic housing demands. The current housing crisis and the working from home reality of many reveals the importance of more homes, but good quality homes. My research shows that there must be a broader conversation on one's perception of density, as this informs the views of communities and to respect this. As the white paper now calls for design codes and for a type of zoning, how density is measured and planned for would require meaningful engagement to develop these new planning tools. However, I believe that there must be a deeper cultural change of perception to improve the process of planning for higher density. I have shared recommendations to inform how this can happen. High density can offer variety, open and built space, tall and short, modern and historic. So with that, I would just like to sort of end my talk, also because I am actually quite thirsty now. So thank you for listening, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that you have. And hopefully I was only mute the whole time.
Fabrizio, I have a question, if I may.
Yes.
I thought that was really very interesting. It's a subject I've not looked at for many years, but very interesting perspective. And you spoke about perception of local people, you know, during the planning process, and that consultation engagement is obviously really important. But when you're looking at people's perceptions, are we actually looking at people's preconceptions? And I just wondered if there's in your maybe the next bit of research for you or for somebody else, or actually to build into that that process that you propose, is actually getting feedback from residents once these developments are up and running, because maybe the people who are saying, oh, I don't like it, it's too dense and it's oppressive and whatever, maybe they're not living in it. So once it's been built and people are living in it and enjoying the environment or not, maybe that's the time to also get feedback and engagement with residents, so you can actually see, was it as bad as people feared? Was it as good as people hoped?
Yeah, definitely. That's something that, you know, kind of like a post-occupancy evaluation, but like post-building evaluation of a development to see, like, was it that bad, basically. But I think, I mean, one point that I have not touched, and I'm sure everyone's thinking about it, is that there's obviously an inherent interest from a homeowner to keep the value of their property. So if the thing changes, then that will have an effect on the value of your asset. And that definitely is something that plays on development, you know, politics and development, you know, delivery of housing. But putting that aside, because that can also inform one's, you know, view, just purely on your own perception, your own background. Absolutely, I think that's something that actually there is already research done by LSE or on high density living, but that's more targeting residents, not targeting those that probably are living around those developments. So I think that would be an interesting resource to have, because that is basically maybe giving insight on whether this, as I said, this cultural change is happening once the schemes are developed. But that should not be used as a tool to suddenly say, well, it's, you know, it ultimately they accept it, because there's also an element of, you know, you have to be critical with any scheme as they come forward. But yeah, that could be a way of getting more information on the subject.
Fabrizio, it's David Sheehan here. Thank you. I really did enjoy your presentation there. I must admit, I've not been involved in any of those 19 buildings you displayed, but I was involved in the Nine Elms Tower and several other towers in Fulham and Whitechapel and places in London. And you were asking the question about how the GLA had a set of rules and basically didn't follow them. And having worked with developing partners who are responsible for actually developing out these buildings, I think the other side of the coin that we haven't touched on is viability. Because I know I've just got aged now, but experience in being in meetings where you could achieve the density, you could achieve the social housing qualities and quantities, but the building would never get built. And with the pressure on the mayoral authority to build houses in central London to avoid some of the scenarios that you have in other main capitals like Paris, for example, that pressure to put good quality housing in central London and as much social housing as you could meant that these people in the GLA were being pulled by so many different measures that they did the best they could with what they could, but actually to get the buildings actually built. I don't know if that's your experience.
No, absolutely. I think that is the one thing that I sort of left out, because otherwise it kind of becomes sort of a cyclical sort of argument that you just never stop, because it is obviously that's a huge part of, again, the development process, how viable schemes are. I mean, I'm just going back to this table because obviously I don't think I stressed this column very much, which is the fact that all these schemes are in designated areas of growth, so opportunity areas, areas of change, and these ones already imply that there's expectation to deliver them. And they also, one of the quotes that I didn't mention was that some contributions are made for infrastructure or just for basically making those schemes happen, that would basically depress the affordable housing contribution, because you need to move a lot of infrastructure just to make these things happen, which also affects the viability, because you are committing funds to unlock the site, and some schemes need more than that than others. So I mean, it may come across as like I'm just basically, being overcritical of the GLA. I know that they're in the capacity as a regional tier, local authority for London. They have to contend a lot. But what at least this exercise kind of showed was that there's a consistent pattern. And it felt that this, one sees it as a, say, as a community organization, or even as a planner, that these are not met, and I think this just, rather than saying, well, viability is a key reason as to why these are not met, one should sort of reverse this target, or even the process of setting these targets, to see how can we manage, because the moment the targets are not met, you also then affect the expectation of people, of residents, of users, and of everyone on the planning process, and also on the credibility of plan making. And I felt that that's something that this sort of research sort of highlighted. But I totally accept that a key driver to delivery of homes is also that these schemes take a long time to come forward, and sometimes it is a difficult decision to say, like, I must take it as it is, mindful of all these deficiencies in terms of my other targets, but it is necessary now because we need the homes and we need to unlock the sites, and you judge it by those merits.
Yeah, this is the. Sorry, Craig.
Question come over from Martin Hornby. I'll come back to you in a minute. Kevin, Martin, did you want to put your question to Fabrizio? I'll ask it for him. He put in the chat box, quality of accommodation as driver for accepting density increase. Does quality factor in the complete adjacent public realm, or only in residents' amenities?
In my experience in my day job, quality is such an elusive term. I mean, developers like to use quality when it comes to just like finish, like, okay, I'm not going to give you as much open space as you asked, but the little space I'm going to give you is going to be amazing. It's going to be ebony. It's going to be like super fancy, and that's one interpretation of quality. But I mean, at my local authority, at least, we see it more as amount of space, and that is meaningful. And even that word is again subjective, and what is a test, because there is no space standard for open space. There is space standard for homes, and there is a type of standard or calculation for place space, but for open space itself there isn't one, other than there is deficiency or there isn't. So it is very difficult to sort of pinpoint that, because one would expect that you will have all this codified and then you just do it. But because in the UK we don't, then we find ourselves in this negotiation process, which has its virtues, but it also has its drawbacks.
Kevin, did you want to put your question?
Yeah, Craig. Yeah, this was good, fantastic presentation. I was really pleased that the last slide was the Barbican. I have a flat in the Barbican. I think it's an absolutely incredible and world-class example of how to get everything right. I mean, I know over the years people have had their views around your brutalist architecture, but taking that aside, I mean, Barbican seems to really have all the elements of density, access to light, you know, the sort of combination of open and space, multi-functions, you know, schools, performing arts, you know, theaters, restaurants, etc. Could you imagine, is it possible in this era for something as bold and something as brilliant as Barbican to be created in London, or are there just differences in the way the rules that are played today that wouldn't allow this to happen in London right now?
It's a very easy question. Well, I think, I mean, the Barbican was designed by many architects. It wasn't just a single vision, even though it looks like it's just by the same person. I think nowadays, maybe I can compare this with my experience with Meridian Water, which is, it's a £6 billion new quarter of London in terms of investment, and it's mixed as this, but not as mixed in terms of its cultural offer. But what we're having, how this has been planned, is very much conservative in the way it chooses to lay out building or master plan building. So it will be, courtyard blocks and towers and streets and front gardens, and just arrange them in a way that is fits in the site plan and then build. Whereas this was far more ambitious in that it dealt in many levels. I mean, as this image shows, you have pedways and lower levels and roof terraces and towers and I feel maybe that's something that I would very much like to revisit, but I'm conscious that there is like a modernist trauma that people don't yet want to sort of revisit. And it happens like even in my day job when we say, well, dual aspect flats, the best ones are the ones that are accessed with a gallery corridor on the outside. You immediately think, oh, but that's like council estate. So you can't really quite revisit it, but then you know that there are very good examples that do it nowadays. So I think to revisit the Barbican or to learn from it and maybe do another version of it would require us to be brave to go into that three-dimensional experience of space, because at the moment we seem to be very, very basic. It seems to be very like street-based, and I'm not criticizing street-based approach. I'm just saying that it's very much like there's only one plane, and then you enter your block, and then you enter your tower, whereas the Barbican is an entirely three-dimensional experience.
Sorry, could I chip in on the Barbican issue?
Yes.
Just to say that it was actually a fairly elitist scheme. My understanding was built by the corporation, and in order to get a flat there, you had to put down a deposit of £3,000 back in the 1970s, which was the equivalent of a new car or something. It's full of rich city people, really, and that's why it works so well, because everyone could afford to maintain it properly. The problem with providing masses of affordable housing is that it's not full of rich people who can afford to maintain things.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, no, and even other schemes in London that you can see that definitely target for wealthy residents, or like for example, I used to live in Pimlico, and I wasn't too far away from Chelsea Barracks. And you can just see that, God, this is, it reaches a point in which it just, it tries to be, street-based, but it just, it cannot be street-based if you have like, a massive sculpture instead of a tree. It's like you're missing some key elements that are just catering for that demographic. But even if this was, funded in that arrangement, and ultimately the custodians or the owners, it's not necessarily a mixed tenure as, Meridian Water is definitely trying to be, and most schemes should aim to be mixed tenure, so not just market rate. There are lessons in this architecture that can still be extracted and used in other schemes. So it's not like, obviously at this scale, you will require that amount of investment, but that doesn't preclude that you should try to use them in other schemes. This is a grand example, but you could equally do parts of the Barbican in other schemes without doing the whole vision.